Hi everyone, I want to continue talking about Ezekiel 46 and 47 and the city of David. I want to continue where I left off, and I want to explain why I believe this is describing the consummation of the covenant starting from chapter 46. I believe the millennial temple is described starting from chapter 40, which is the restored temple. I believe it all has to do with DNA ultimately. And it begins to describe the restored temple starting from chapter 40, but the actual consummation of the covenant begins with chapter 46. So this is when the restoration actually takes place, and I believe chapters 46 through 48 are basically describing a moment in time, and then Ezekiel chapter 48 is basically the restoration. I believe that's why it mentions the 12 tribes, which I believe represents the 144,000. And as I stated in my last video, it gives all these measurements, and then at the very end, the very last line says it was round about 18,000 measures, and the name of the city from that day shall be The Lord is There. And I thought it was interesting that the command to rebuild the temple was in 1948, and 70 years from that date would be 2018. So I believe this is a veiled reference to the year 18. And I was watching a video this morning by Pastor Sandy Armstrong, which I believe further confirms that, because he was talking about some numbers as well that I want to get into a little bit. But the main thing that I wanted to point out is that in Joshua 19, you have the same thing happening. He had pointed out how it goes through the 12 tribes of Israel, and it gives out the inheritance and every tribe's portion of the inheritance. And then when you get to verse 49, it says, when they had made an end of dividing the land for inheritance by their coasts, the children of Israel gave an inheritance to Joshua, the son of Nun, among them. And so the division ends with the 48th verse. So you have 1948 over here, and the inheritance is given to the 12 tribes. Okay, and so now this is 70 years later from 1948, and it's the year 2018, and over here in Ezekiel 48 it's talking about the millennial temple. And as I showed in my last video, there's all sorts of references that seem to be pointing to the years 17 and 18 in the scriptures. Okay, another thing that Pastor Sandy Armstrong pointed out is how in Isaiah 46, God says, starting from verse 9, it says, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is none else. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do my pleasure." Okay, so I thought it was interesting that God declares the end from the beginning in Isaiah 46. And then the consummation of the covenant begins with chapter 46, which is what I want to get into in a little bit. But first I just want to go over a few more numbers. Okay, another thing that he points out is that in the very first verse of Genesis, it alludes to the 6,000 years because there's 6 alephs, and the letter aleph means 1,000, so you have 6,000s in the very first verse. And then, as I've mentioned before, when you go to the second verse in Genesis 1, it says, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." And the word in the Greek is a word that means brought forth, which just so happens to be Strong's 2018. Okay, and so I'll just show you this word. It's 2018, and so when you go back to Genesis 2, this is when God brings forth the waters upon the face of the deep, or upon the face of the earth, and the waters actually refers to sperm, as has been pointed out before. And it's interesting that Strong's number 4325, so that's 23 backwards right inside the Strong's number. But as I've pointed out before, and has been pointed out, is that the word waters is a euphemism for sperm. And so this is actually referring to the consummation of the covenant. This is another example of how God tells the end from the beginning, and when he brings this about, the Strong's number for the word bring about is 2018. And so that's what I want to explain some more, how this is the consummation of the covenant. This is what the waters is referring to. Of course, this is also talking about the creation of Elohim in the beginning, but as Isaiah 46 tells us, God tells us the end from the beginning, and this entire book is all about DNA, as I've explained in several videos before. And so this is the consummation of the covenant, and I believe God has given us the year right here at the beginning. Okay, another thing that I wanted to point out that's really interesting about the numbers, and why I believe the numbers 46 through 48, and particularly 47, because the command to rebuild the temple went out in 1947, and then of course Israel became a nation in 1948. So I believe all these numbers are important, starting with number 46, which has to do with DNA, because that's what the river of life is referring to, the living water, and I can get into that a little more later. But I found this article because I was trying to understand the flow of the water, how it comes out from the temple, and I can get into that a little bit later. But I clicked on this image over here because I thought it was interesting that it mentions the living waters in John 4 and John 7, and then it mentions the living waters in Ezekiel 47. So you have the 4 and the 7. So I clicked on the article because I thought that was interesting, and I noticed some other interesting numbers that I've noticed before. But you also have the living waters mentioned in Joel 3:18, which is something I've noted before. It says, "And in that day the mountains shall drip sweet wine, and the hills shall flow with milk, and all the stream beds of Judah shall flow with water, and a fountain shall come forth from the house of the Lord, and water the valley of Shittim." This is a verse that I've pointed out before. It comes up in verse 18, and then it's in verse 8 in Zechariah 14, when the Mount of Olives splits and the living waters flows. And I had understood that to be the consummation of the covenant, and understood what the living waters represent. And at the time I had no idea that the living waters, or that the word water is actually a euphemism for sperm. I just understood it based on the other words and events that were being depicted, and I've made videos about that. But at the time I had no idea that this word, that the waters, means sperm, but that's what I understood it to be. But this is in verse 8, where it says, "And on that day living waters shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea, and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter." And then of course it talks about the living waters again in Revelation 22, which, as I've mentioned, I believe this all has to do with DNA. I believe that's why it's in chapter 22 in the book of Revelation. Incidentally, if you look at the word crystal over here, it says, "And he showed me a pure river of the water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding out of the throne of God and of the Lamb." And as I've said, I believe the river of life and the tree of life represents a DNA strand. But if you look at the word crystal, you see that it comes up in Revelation 4:6 and Revelation 22, and these are both numbers having to do with DNA. Okay, there was also this other article that I found when I was trying to understand the flow of the water of the river that's described in Ezekiel 47, which, as I stated, I believe this ultimately represents DNA, but it also represents the consummation of the covenant, which is what I want to get into. But you see that it's also talked about the same river as it states over here in Psalms 46:4. So again, you have 46, which is the number of chromosomes in a human body, and you have it frontwards and backwards. And it was Psalm 46 that Obama had read at the 9/11 memorial, but it reads, "God is our refuge and strength, the very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though the waters thereof roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with the swelling thereof. There is a river, the streams whereof shall make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacles of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, she shall not be moved. God shall help her, and that right early. The heathen raged, the kingdoms were moved, he uttered his voice, the earth melted, the Lord of hosts is with us, the God of Jacob is our refuge. Come, behold the works of the Lord, what desolations he hath made in the earth. He maketh wars to cease unto the end of the earth. He breaketh the bow, and cutteth the spear in sunder. He burneth the chariot in the fire. Be still, and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the heathen. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge." Okay, so it's saying here that this is the same river that's being talked about in Psalms 46, and that it's also the same river that's talked about in Genesis 2:8 through 10. So again, you have the number 28 there, which looks like 2018. Okay, and this reads, "And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it parted and became into four heads." And I've talked about how I believe the four heads are the four gamete cells that are developed when a cell divides, when it's for the purpose of reproduction. Okay, so this water that comes out from the threshold of the temple, and it eventually meets over here with the Gihon spring, and there was a tunnel that was built or excavated by Hezekiah, and it leads to the Siloam pool. And the Siloam pool in the New Testament was where people went for healing. It's where Jesus told the person that was blind to go to wash his eyes off, and so it was for healing. Okay, so I wanted to understand exactly what Hezekiah's tunnel was. Over here it says the Siloam tunnel, also known as Hezekiah's tunnel, is a water tunnel that was carved underneath the city of David in Jerusalem in ancient times. The tunnel leads from the Gihon spring to the pool of Siloam, and so it's also known as the Siloam tunnel. So I pulled up this Wikipedia article, and I thought it was really interesting when you click on this image over here of the spring and the tunnel. It says that the pool of Siloam was also known as the fountain of the Virgin. It says here the Gihon spring, or the fountain of the Virgin, in the Kidron Valley was the main source of water for the Siloam pool in the city of David, the original site of Jerusalem. And so I thought it was really amazing that the spring that leads to the pool is referred to as the fountain of the Virgin, and then you have the fountain gate located over here. And so I have a lot more to talk about concerning Hezekiah's tunnel and how all of this is connected, and the city of David and the consummation of the covenant, but I'll have to do that in the next video. Thanks for watching, and God bless you.